January 15, 1953, Washington Union Station, Pennsylvania Railroad GG1 number 4876 crashes through the station floor at roughly 35 miles per hour, according to the official Interstate Commerce Commission investigation, and drops into the basement with roughly 400 passengers on board. Engineer Harry W. Brower knew the brakes were gone 15 minutes before impact, but he stayed at the controls, hammering the air horn instead of jumping to save himself. Dozens of people were injured. Nobody was in the morgue because the workers who normally occupied that basement area were not present at the moment of impact, according to survivor accounts. The Pennsylvania Railroad GG1 spent 49 years as the most famous electric locomotive in America, hauling trains at over 100 miles per hour up and down the Northeast Corridor with those distinctive Raymond Loewy pinstripes that everyone recognized. It pulled the Broadway Limited and every other prestigious train the Pennsylvania Railroad operated, while also handling connecting services for other railroads. Here is the thing though. The GG1 was cancerous, and that is not dramatic language, but verified medical fact from the World Health Organization. In December 1934, the Pennsylvania Railroad needs to replace the P5A electrics that keep failing in passenger service because they are underpowered at 3,750 horsepower, and their rigid frames crack from traction motor torque. The railroad tests a borrowed New Haven Railroad EP3 and decides that it wants something similar. It tells General Electric and Westinghouse to each build a prototype. Westinghouse produces the R1 with roughly 5,000 horsepower and a rigid frame that looks good on paper, though sources vary slightly. General Electric produces the GG1 with 4,620 continuous horsepower, and some enthusiast sources suggest short-term peaks higher than this, though those peaks are not documented in formal Pennsylvania Railroad test records. Both prototypes go through 10 weeks of testing at Claymont, Delaware, and in passenger service between New York and Philadelphia. The R1 cannot handle sharp urban curves without putting dangerous lateral forces on the rails because of that rigid wheelbase. The GG1's articulated frame, with a ball joint connecting two separate trucks, negotiates tight curves without issue. In November 1934, the Pennsylvania Railroad ordered 57 GG1s and eventually built 139 between 1934 and 1943. Each locomotive was 79 feet 6 inches long and weighed 475,000 pounds, with 12 traction motors producing 385 horsepower each through a quill drive transmission. They drew 11,000 volts alternating current at 25 Hz from the overhead catenary and stepped it down through a massive oil-cooled transformer mounted in the center of the car body between two crew cabs. That center cab design came about because a P5A engineer lost his life in a grade crossing accident, so PRR moved the crew to the middle for better protection. Historical accounts indicate the GG1's transformers used insulating oils based on PCBs, commonly sold under trade names including Ascarel. PCBs are toxic chemicals that turned out to be cancer-causing. Every one of those 139 locomotives ran with transformers filled with PCB insulating oil from 1935 through 1983, when New Jersey Transit finally retired the last units. Maintenance crews and shop workers were likely exposed during routine transformer servicing over the locomotive's nearly 5 decades in service. Typical tasks included testing fluid, replacing gaskets, draining transformers, and rebuilding electrical components. Nobody knew there was a problem because PCBs were chosen for their non-flammable properties and excellent heat transfer, so everyone thought they were working with one of the safest industrial fluids available. The International Agency for Research on Cancer classified polychlorinated biphenyls, or PCBs, as probably carcinogenic in Group 2A. In 2013, they upgraded that to Group 1 based on sufficient evidence from human studies and animal research. Group 1 means carcinogenic to humans, with consistent associations between PCB exposure and increased cancer risk. The specific cancers linked to occupational exposure include melanoma, which showed the strongest correlation and was the primary reason for the upgrade. Other cancers included liver cancer, gastrointestinal cancers, intestinal cancer in female workers, brain cancer in electrical equipment workers, multiple myeloma in male workers, and non-Hodgkin lymphoma, with clear dose-response relationships where higher blood PCB levels meant higher cancer rates. Internal union records later suggested elevated melanoma cases among workers who service GG1 locomotives. That data did not come from a formal epidemiological study of GG1 maintenance crews, so the evidence remains limited rather than definitive. The exposure came from routine maintenance that every GG1 went through over decades of service. Workers could be exposed during transformer servicing by contact with PCB containing oil or vapors. They could absorb PCBs through skin contact when handling contaminated parts, and receive secondary exposure from contaminated work clothing and tools. Studies of electrical capacitor manufacturing workers with similar exposure patterns showed that cumulative exposure was associated with increased total cancer rates. Those workers performed essentially the same maintenance activities that GG1 shop crews performed year after year. By the late 1960s, information about health concerns had begun circulating in the scientific literature, but it is unclear how extensively this was recognized within Pennsylvania Railroad management when papers started documenting health problems in industrial workers. Replacing transformers in 139 locomotives would have cost millions that a bankrupt Penn Central could not afford. The locomotives kept running. Workers kept servicing transformers. Management kept quiet. When Conrail inherited the fleet in 1976, the federal ban on polychlorinated biphenyls was already law, but the locomotives were grandfathered under an exemption for existing equipment in enclosed systems, so they could remain in service. Beyond cancer, long-term studies of workers exposed to polychlorinated biphenyls reported additional health concerns such as liver abnormalities, possible reproductive effects, thyroid disruption, neurological symptoms, immune suppression, and elevated cardiovascular risks in some populations. PCBs are stored in body fat and build up over time instead of leaving the body quickly. Once they are in the body, there is no established medical method for rapid removal because they eliminate slowly over years or decades. The United States banned PCB manufacture in 1977 after the evidence became clear, but the GG1 locomotives kept running with their PCB-filled transformers for another 6 years, until 1983. When the locomotives were finally retired, every transformer had to be removed and destroyed as hazardous waste. This is one of the primary reasons no preserved GG1 locomotive will ever operate again, because replacing those transformers with modern alternatives significantly reduces effective power output due to poorer heat transfer performance compared to the original PCB-filled units. The second reason involves structural failure. As the fleet accumulated millions of miles at high speeds with heavy trains, the cast steel frames started developing cracks that became an escalating problem throughout the 1970s. The split frame design with a ball joint in the middle was supposed to prevent the kind of damage that destroyed the earlier P5A fleet, but decades of repeated stress from acceleration and braking, combined with temperature changes and rust, created weak points that spread cracks through the cast steel. Those cracks got worse and more expensive to fix over time, and they became the final nail in the coffin, because even if the toxic transformers were replaced, the frames would still be broken and would need massive repairs or total replacement. Many of the 16 preserved GG1 locomotives in museums have cracked frames that would require non-destructive testing, specialized welding, and heat treatment to repair, assuming a facility could be found that is capable of casting replacement frames that large. That 1953 crash happened because of a design flaw on New Haven Railroad coach number 8665. A valve handle on an angle cock could contact the coupler and close during recoupling in Baltimore. Only the first 3 cars had working brakes, while the rear 13 kept pushing forward, no matter what Engineer Brower did. The Interstate Commerce Commission investigation confirmed the flaw and led to stricter brake system checks during switching. Locomotive 4876 had to be cut into pieces to remove it from the basement, with the frame and superstructure mostly scrapped in place, while reusable components were shipped to Altoona to build what was essentially a new locomotive that returned to service and ran for another 30 years. Today, that locomotive sits outside at the B&O Railroad Museum in Baltimore in deteriorated condition after the 2003 roof collapse delayed restoration plans. 16 GG1 locomotives remain in museums with all their transformers removed and many with cracked frames. None will ever operate again because the very design that made them powerful for 49 years also made them cancerous to the crews who maintained them.